Welcome, divas and dudes, to Powerhouse Bakery. I hope you're doing great and staying cool this summer. We are into our nutrition class and we're going to cover carbohydrates today. So lots of great stuff. I hope you have your best foods list nearby. You've got pen and paper in hand because we're going to talk a little bit of science and a whole lot of nutrition. So let's have some fun. When we think about carbohydrates, we think of a continuum of goodies. But for the most part, we know that carbohydrates are our body's fuel. So we know that carbohydrates are going to be the stuff of energy. We know that athletes depend on carbohydrates. We know that everybody is going to need some level of carbohydrates because of the energy that it provides our body. When we think about the science of carbohydrates, sometimes we get kind of in the weeds, if you will, and we think of, well, how many calories do carbohydrates provide? And what about if I want to follow a low carbohydrate diet in order to be healthier? So those are questions I want to help you kind of navigate through. And some of the other important components of looking at carbohydrates is when we think of diseases. And what we like to call it is dis-ease. So it's not easy to have problems with blood sugar. And so when we look at elevated blood sugar, what does that mean and who does that really pertain to? And more importantly, when does that happen? So we're going to talk a little bit about blood sugar. We're going to talk a little bit about what happens when we get too much carbohydrates from a given meal, or if we're eating them over time, and how does that affect our overall wellness. And so when we look at carbohydrates, there's a lot going on. We know that carbohydrates come from plant foods, and that's a big category in and of itself. We know that they come from grains, and from grains we can make things like bread and, of course, pastas and buns and tortillas. So the ultimate base is going to be a grain, which comes from the earth. And we know that in general, eating more from the earth is important. You've heard me talk a lot about that, and understanding how we use that idea and then bring it to Fulbright and understand how we can eat carbohydrates in a healthy way is really what I want us to learn about today. And so when we learn about the grains, we also need to understand that fruits are going to be part of the foods that give us carbohydrates. We know that there's a wide variety of fruits, and of course with them comes some fiber and other vitamins, of course minerals, and all of these are part of the package that we enjoy when we eat carbohydrates. And so that's something that I want us to really be aware of, and that in general carbohydrates are the majority of where our calories come from. In fact, when the USDA has created guidelines for what is healthy, they tell us that 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates are important. Well, what is a serving? You've heard me talk a lot about that, and that servings is a very vague term. So I want to be able to talk a lot about that and understand that 6 to 11 sounds like a big number, and of course it could easily become excess. But when we start looking at actual portion sizes that this idea was built on, it actually is pretty small. The other thing that the USDA pyramid really teaches us is that when we're looking at carbohydrates, we have things that are at the top of the list that we want to eat a very small amount of, and then when we want to eat a majority of good carbohydrates, they fall down into the lower base. And so when we call them good or even great carbohydrates, they're down at the base. And so that would be things like veggies, lentils, and other beans. And of course, the grains are such a wide variety that all of those absolutely fit into the carbohydrate category that we want to pick from. And in general, carbohydrates have become sort of the bad guy of the nutrition world. And if you're above the age of 40, you'll also remember that fats were considered the bad guy of the nutrition world. And now they've been put into a better category, and so carbohydrates are in that bad category. But what we want to understand about that is carbohydrates, when they are highly refined or in their most simple state, that's when they start looking like they're in the not so healthy category. But it doesn't mean that we have to take sweets out of our diet altogether, because we know that there's still some great qualities of sweet foods that we can really make a part of our healthy eating style. So let's look a little bit about the nutrition. If we figure the calorie balance equation, we know that our energy level has to equal our output. So our energy in has to balance our output of energy. And that's why I mentioned in the beginning of this video that athletes care a whole lot about carbohydrates. They want to have a lot of energy to perform. They want to have adequate energy to go through their day, and then when they're ready for their workout, they want an explosive amount of energy. So that's going to help us understand the difference in types of energy sources. So would it be a simple sugar like an apple or some grapes or some honey or some white rice to give us quick energy, or would it be an energy source that takes a lot longer to go from our gut to our bloodstream? So important question there. But when we look at the calorie balance equation, we want to understand how much energy do we need, and should it equal our output so that we don't have excess. So anytime we have a lot more going in than what's going out, we're going to have excess. So let's talk about what happens when we have excess carbohydrates. So carbs in excess have to go somewhere. And truly, our body is so good at preserving and saving energy because we didn't always live in a world that had an HEB with shelves full of food. We had to learn how to survive. And so our bodies were very good at storing extra energy. And the way we store extra energy is in a couple of different sources. Of course, you've heard that when you eat more carbs, you get an increase in blood sugar. And if you have a disease like diabetes, that increase in blood sugar causes havoc. And I want to clear up a little bit about what that means. So whenever your blood sugar is elevated, when we have a healthy pancreas, our pancreas is going to put out insulin, and that's going to help our body take the blood sugar down, and that blood sugar goes into the muscle cell. And that's where it's going to be metabolized and used for all the energy that we need. So when it gets into the muscle cell, that's a good thing. But what if we overeat and that blood sugar gets so high that our insulin level is not able to adequately bring that blood sugar down? Maybe it's from diabetes, maybe it's because we had Thanksgiving dinner and had extra pie and our blood sugar remains high for at least a period of time. In either case, we're always going to figure out where that extra nutrient or that energy is going to get stored. So if our extra energy cannot be burned by the muscle cell, it's going to go into storage. So the trick is, how do we manage that storage? You probably know that in general, extra storage of carbohydrates are going to go where? We think fat cells, which is true. But if you're an athlete and you have trained your machine to be really good at managing this energy, because we know that sometimes our output is going to be great, and sometimes our output's not going to be all that high, right? So we have this little varied amount. Sometimes we need a lot of energy for that muscle cell, sometimes not so much. We have a day where we're working in the office, and then we have another day when we walk an 8-mile hike. So whenever we have this intermediate need for energy, and we've trained our body to manage storage better, we've got this awesome other approach to storage, and that's called glycogen. And this is the stuff of athletes. And we don't all have to be endurance athletes or an Olympic athlete to benefit from glycogen. And so that's what I want us to really think about, is as we're taking in energy and our output is not so great on occasion, how do we modify that blood sugar levels and the insulin that's needed for our muscle cells to get all that activity or the energy for the activity? We have to increase our glycogen stores. And the only way we can do that is to exercise. So the more exercise you can do of your muscles, the better, because now we can really train that storage depot to be glycogen and not so much fat. Okay? So that's my little science with all this crazy diagram. The summary of it all is that if you control your portions, that's very important. Portion control is always going to be key. Thinking about balancing your macronutrients, meaning that when you create your plate, you want to have some carbohydrate, about a fist size. You want to have some food that's going to provide protein, about a palm size. And you want to have plenty of fiber on that plate. You want to have a little bit of fat on that plate too. So balance is super important even when you're looking at carbohydrates. Now, let's look at the disease state a little bit more. We talked about the athlete being at an advantage because they have a separate way to store sugars. Now, the other thing that we want to do is look at what happens with blood sugar when it goes up. If you have a problem with your pancreas, or you know somebody that has, say, the disease diabetes, blood sugar is a problem because it affects the way that your blood cells, so your red blood cells, can carry oxygen. So the red blood cells, when there's too much sugar in the blood, makes it very difficult to carry oxygen on that red blood cell. So blood sugar elevation when you have something like diabetes is very important because it compromises how well your body can function. You probably have heard of a term called A1C level. Pretty common when your blood sugar is elevated. So when this A1C level goes above normal, that means that your body's tissues are not able to get as much oxygen as we want. So it's very important that you watch that A1C number if in fact you have a tendency for elevated blood sugars and a history or a family history of diabetes. What about if we're trying to fight cancer? This is another component where carbohydrates and the type of carbohydrates will really matter. We know that sugars help to feed fast-growing cells. So we want to make sure that any fast-growing cell in our body does not get an abundance of sugar. So when we're learning about carbohydrates, we want to look at which carbohydrates are going to give us the best bang for our buck. And that's what we're going to go on to next. So where can we get the best bang for our calorie dollar? And this is where we start to understand the difference between complex and simple carbohydrates. When we think of simple carbohydrates, this is where we start seeing more of the quick action energy. Simple gives a lot of energy. So if you do have a sweet tooth and you want to enjoy some sweets, we need to make sure that we increase our energy expenditure. So whether you have diabetes, or you're trying to fight cancer, or you're trying to even watch your weight, what's going to really help modify your storage of sugars is increase your energy expenditure. So get out and walk. Absolutely important to start to build more energy into your day. The other part that we want to look at is what part of our bodies burn the most energy, muscle. So increasing your muscle mass is going to also be super important. So when you have simple carbohydrates that we consider things like honey or white rice and fruits, these are going to make it quick energy sources. When we have quick energy sources, we want the muscle to be able to utilize those quickly so that we do not have an elevation in blood sugar. Anytime we have an elevated blood sugar, that means the fast-growing cells that we don't want in our body are going to get more fuel than what we want. And so cutting that out is super important. The last part of this whole equation is looking at total calories. And so now, if we put aside the idea of storage, and we put away the idea of fighting dis-ease, what about our healthy individual that's trying to have calorie balance? In the science world, we sometimes think of the basal metabolic rate. So in the science world, whether you're at a fitness center or at your doctor's office, sometimes folks will try to understand how many calories do we need. And based on our basal metabolic rate, that just means how many calories do we need to stay alive. And that has everything to depend on our age, of course, our body mass, so how much muscle do we have on board. And of course, when we look at activity level, all of these things are going to have to do with how many calories does our body need. And again, when we're looking at energy, carbohydrates are the main source of where we get these calories. And so when we look at our basal needs, we know age has a factor, muscle mass has a factor, and how much activity we do. And like I just mentioned, we have control over a lot of this. We can't stop aging, we can't stop our genetics, but we sure can have an impact on our muscle and how much activity we choose to do. So when we're deciding what our basal needs are of calories, more exercise and more muscle absolutely help the bottom line. So when we look at the calorie balance and we want to understand how many calories do we need, how do we determine that? A lot of folks will go onto a website and they'll punch in their age and their gender and their activity level, and they'll come up with a calorie need. If you've ever used MyFitnessPal, that's an example of a formula that will say, okay, a female, age 45, 5'4", weighs 140 pounds, here's your calorie needs, just to stay alive. And then the next question in the formula will say, what's your goal? Are you happy with your current weight, or do you want to have weight loss? Or do you want to gain weight? And of course, I know nobody wants to gain fat, everybody wants to gain muscle. And so that's a whole different topic, is how do we make our body gain what we want? Well, again, activity is so important. Activity rules in every sense of the word. So when we're thinking about our calorie needs and we decide what our goal is, that's going to be the big picture in determining what our calorie requirements are. So my suggestion is that if you do use a formula that's out on the internet, use it as only one tool, because formulas do not tell you the whole story. What we really want to do is figure also your body needs. So appetite and portion size are always going to trump what the formula tells us. That is the claim here that's so important. Portion matters. And I know you've heard me say that a few times. Portion absolutely matters. So when we're thinking about the formula that tells us what our basal metabolic rate should be, that's the scientific guesstimate that we're going to use based on our gender and our height and our weight and our activity level. But appetite and portion are going to be a big role to play. How many people have you heard when they follow a diet plan, they eat by the clock, or they eat by what the label tells them? So the label says, well, I just had a portion of peanut butter because the portion was 2 tablespoons, so I just had 2 tablespoons. My suggestion is we don't want to let the label guide our portion. Instead, you want to use your own food preference and your own body guide. So food preference and appetite. Because when we're looking at carbohydrates, it can be very complicated. We might decide that in general, a breakfast meal might be a slice of toast. We look at our carbs. or it might be a muffin or pancakes. These are all carbohydrates, right? And they all are great choices. We can pick a certain type of bread to make toast that's got balanced nutrients. Remember, that's one of our healthy rules to live by. We can pick a muffin that's a good balance of nutrients. It might even have some healthy seeds worked in. We can certainly make pancakes a healthy breakfast depending on what it's made out of. So carbohydrates are not the issue. We can pick great choices of carbohydrates. What becomes the issue of making a carbohydrate great is not only the portion, but the type. So simple to complex, we're going to talk about a little bit more, but really today I want you to think about where your carbohydrates energy is used in your different meal planning. So if we think of carbohydrates as being a great source of energy, we do not want to cut them out of our diet. We also want to be careful with the amount that we have in each sitting, because whenever we go to storage of carbohydrates, there's really only two things that can happen with a carbohydrate. It can go to fat storage, or it can go to muscle storage. So if it goes to muscle storage, we've got to use it, which means you need to get out and walk and help your muscles stay strong so that they can use more energy. When the calories that you consume from carbohydrates are in excess, they also can go to the fat cells, and it's very hard to get those sugar molecules out of the fat cells once they've already been put in there, which we all know, which is why it's hard to have a successful weight loss program and take out and not have carbohydrates taken out completely. We definitely want to make sure that this is not our normal storage route. Remember that the short-term location for carbohydrates is in our blood sugar, and that's a very normal way that our body manages the sugars that we eat to feed all of our organs. So our liver and our kidney and for sure our brain all rely on blood sugar for adequate energy. And that blood sugar has a very good way of being monitored with our pancreas and our, of course, brain, making sure that that blood sugar is at normal level. Whenever there's excess, it's going to go to storage. And let's hope that your storage depot called Glycogen is going to be number one spot where your extra blood sugar will go. And remember that having small portions throughout the day is the best way to do it. Trying to eat one big meal or two big meals not only leaves extra carbohydrate calories for cancer-growing cells or exacerbate a disease like diabetes, it also means that our fat cells are going to get more of what we don't want them to get, and that is storage energy. So in general, keep going with your best foods list. Make sure that your complex carbohydrates are going to be things that have a very little bit of sugar. And whenever you do choose a sugar, make sure that it's got lots of nutrients included, like the sugars that we find naturally in fresh fruits and in vegetables, and even those complex carbohydrates like potatoes and grains. Just make sure they've got lots of color on them, and you'll be doing great getting those nutrients. So go out for a walk and burn some calories so you can build your muscle glycogen. We'll see you soon.